Welcome back to the Planting Roots podcast. I'm Stephen Partain, one of the pastors of Grace Community Church in New Orleans, Louisiana. Thanks for walking with us in these 5-minute segments through the prophet Isaiah. So this week we're going to be in Isaiah starting in chapter 9, verse 1 through chapter 10, verse 4. And for us, this is actually a pretty exciting chapter because it gives us a sign of hope. A sign of hope. So what's been happening to this point? We learned in the last section in Isaiah that the Assyrian invasion is simply going to happen, right? That Isaiah has understood that this problem is going to take place. There's going to be destruction, and the response to it is something that's up to the people of God. They simply have to determine how they're going to deal with this. And so we look here starting in verse 1 that says this. It says, nevertheless, in chapter 9, verse 1, nevertheless, the gloom will not be upon her who is distressed, when at first he is lightly esteemed, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterward more heavily oppressed her, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, and the Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has shined. So the gloom is coming. The gloom is this invasion from the Assyrian army. But there is a promise. There's something happening that's greater. The gloom will not be upon her who is distressed, we see in verse 1. So what exactly is going to be happening here? Well, there's a promise, right? There's a promise for God's people that he has not abandoned them, but he's actually going to give them a sign, right? At this point, a sign is a very important thing. When things are going so poorly around them, the prophet Isaiah is going to point them to a sign that makes all the difference. So we come down in verse 3, read this. You have multiplied the nation and increased its joy, and they rejoice before you, according to the joy of the harvest. As men rejoice when they divide the spoil, for you have broken the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. For every warrior's sandal from the noisy battle and garments will be rolled in blood, will be used for burning in the fuel of the fire. So we're seeing there's a bigger picture happening here. There's someone who's going to break the yoke of the burden. Even though the oppressor is coming, there's a picture that's beyond all of this. There's a victory that's happening on the other side of this. So you can see the prophet Isaiah does speak truth about what is happening, yes. But there's also a bigger picture and a sign of hope that he's about to help us understand what that is. So where is the hope coming from? Who is the one that's going to do this? What are we speaking about? We get to verse 6, we read this. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder. His name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. Now you might have heard this before. This is something we actually read in the New Testament in concerning the person of Jesus, the prophecy about who Jesus is. So what's happening here? Is this referring directly to Jesus himself in this passage? Well, as Christians, we believe that the prophecy is being used in the New Testament to definitely point to who Christ is and to his government being upon his shoulder and his name being Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Prince of Peace. That's absolutely help us understand who God is. But in this situation, it's talking about there's a birth of a new son in the royal household, right? That there's one who's coming, and that one who is coming is going to bring deliverance, right? That hope is coming because through this birth, through this son, through this man, God is going to do a work, right? And it's wonderful. Counselor. All of these things that they need for this time of chaos, he will be all of those things. And it even points to the idea of mighty God. Like there's something happening beyond this, that it's not just simply the Son, but it's that God is at work in the Son. Verse 7, of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order and establish it with judgment and justice. From that time forward, even forever, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. So for us, what does this mean as we think about followers of Jesus? It means that, yes, there is a sign of hope, that in the moment, God is going to bring someone that brings a sign of hope to his people. But even bigger than this, the ultimate hope that this foreshadows is the hope of Christ. So even in a book like Isaiah, that's a prophet from so long ago, we see that God's hope and promise has always been there for his people. That in their times of trouble, they could trust in the moment he would deliver, but ultimately that he would deliver. The same for us. We can trust that God will help us in the current moment, but also long-term will deliver his people. So thanks for listening to the Planting Roots podcast. Keep digging into Isaiah as we walk through it together. We're glad you're walking with us.